If you carry a firearm and discharge your weapon in self-defense, you could face hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and expenses. So carry the protection of CCW Safe, Self-Defense Legal Services membership. Upfront payment of all criminal and civil defense costs with no out-of-pocket for members. Unlimited defense budgets, unmatched legal expertise. Carry the same level of support police officers have. Carry CCW Safe, the highest caliber.
Hey there, Patriots. Welcome to Survival Dispatch News, where we cut through the noise and with hard truth and biblical conviction. You're the heart of the nation, men and women who stand for God, family, and the Constitution. So we're here to equip you with real knowledge, no fluff, because the battle for our Christian heritage and freedoms is on. I am John Wheaton, your host for this evening, as usual on a Tuesday night. And as usual as well, I'm here with my cohort in anti-communist propaganda, Mr. S2. And how are you tonight, friend?
Good to be here, brother. Good to be here.
Good. All right. So we've got a big subject, continuing our subject matter of communism throughout the years. And we are to a period of time where a lot of people thought we had won because the wall had come down in Russia, and many of the ancient or older powers from the 21st century were kind of in ruin. And we're here to show you that that was actually not the case. That was a big lie. And maybe there's something behind that. And so we're going to get into that in a moment. But before we do, I have a big announcement, kind of a replay of a couple of weeks ago. We were supposed to go down to WAFT, but had some issues with airplanes, myself, and things that ended up making us have to move that. So we're moving it to next week. So next week, myself, Dave Kemp, my co-founder of Righteous Savages, Mike the Mad Bomber, and James from Pilgrim Ammo are all going to be making our way to WAFT in Central Florida to do a day of training and content filming for you guys. That'll be coming up very, very soon. And so you don't want to miss out on that. Guardian memberships, because it's always important for you guys to know that you do get more if you sign up for the Guardian membership. It's only $7.99 a month currently, or it's $74.99 a year. That's about 2.5 months free if you sign up for a year. Benefits include a myriad of things, including a six days a week. You get the sit rep for the show, which gives you kind of a preview of what we're going to talk about. Access to the private signal chat. It is very high traffic, and you guys, you get in there. Sometimes it's hard to keep up if you're not constantly engaged. $370 worth of Survival Dispatch Insider e-magazines. Access to the background Substack chat as well. That's kind of our backup if things go south with Signal and that gets deleted. It's always important to have a backup. So the Substack chat is available to all of our Guardians as well. And early access to JJ Morris's videos twice weekly. The Sunday Threat Matrix, which is actually debuting this week. I got a preview of it today, and you guys are going to be extremely happy with the quality of content that's coming your way. And then the SDEN system, which is the Survival Dispatch Emergency Notification. That's going to be over text or email, depending on your connection. And it's a way for you guys to stay informed on current events, rising threats, and anything that is going to be pertinent for you as an American, a Christian, and a person concerned with their family. We do not have any headline news today because, as me and S2 were talking before we went live, this first section may actually take us the majority of the show. We have a lot to cover in this period of time that everybody thought was dormant from communism. And we're talking really about, we're revealing how communism survived the Cold War, but shedded its Soviet skin, rebranded as through global institutions, and infiltrated culture, technology, and politics. And that really built between the years of 1989 and 2015. That's really where we're focusing on, because when we get past 2015, we're talking about really what we're dealing with now. So that was, and some of that is we're going to get into in the tail end of this, but if we even get there, we may have to save some of this for another episode. But we're going to start off. This isn't just history. It's a wake-up call for conservative. Communism 2.0 threatens our God-given rights, our duty to provide for our families, 1 Timothy 5:8, and our freedom to worship. That is one of the things they want to take away from us here in America, and they have nibbled around the edges of that. It's about personal responsibility, rejecting centralized control, and shielding our communities from godless ideologies. We're exposing the enemy's playbook so you can stand firm. Our first subject is the myth of collapse. And I know S2 has a lot to talk about this. 1989 to 1991, we reopened the fall of the Berlin Wall. Everybody who is old enough remembers when that happened. Tear down this wall speech, and shortly after that, the wall started coming down in Germany that had separated East and West Germany for a generation since the end of World War II, shortly after the end of World War II. And that was a result of us being rather soft with the communists. A little side note that's not necessarily what I prepared was there were a few generals in the Allied Army that realized that the USSR was a massive threat. George S. Patton being the main one that pointed this out and said that we should have just gone to war with Russia at that time. Ironically, he ended up dead from mysterious circumstances shortly after that he was ranting about that. But there were a lot of people that realized that appeasement was not an answer for communism, and they were right. And we did not actually curtail it at that point. And what happened next was the building of what eventually fell in 1989. We'll say in quotations marks fell. But the Berlin Wall falls and the breakup of the USSR to show that how Marxist networks, KGB alumni, and oligarchs quietly regrouped while the West declared victory. So I'm going to bring up an article from the Heritage Foundation so you guys can see this, and I'm going to let I'm going to let S2. Sorry, I am really tired tonight, guys. So if I seem a little out of it, I am rather exhausted. I was up late last night and trying to hold it together for you guys. So S2, I'm going to let you speak to some of this stuff about the fall of Russia or the fall of the USSR and how it was really kind of a victory that should not have been declared.
Well, the collapse was a multifaceted thing that was driven by the economic, political, social, and international factors. And basically the bullet points are this, is that you had economic stagnation in the USSR. By the 1980s, the Soviet centrally planned economy was inefficient. They were plagued by shortages on consumer goods. They had low productivity, and they had technological lag. They had heavy military spending, which was probably accounted for about 15 to 20% of their GDP, and it strained their resources while the consumer goods were scarce, and that eroded the public support for communism at that point, or rather the regime at that current time. You also had political reforms that were causing problems. You had glasnost. Glasnost means openness, and then you had the perestroika, which was the restructuring, and it was aimed to modernize the system, but that backfired. Glasnost allowed criticism of the regime, fueling dissent, while perestroika's economic reforms created chaos without delivering any prosperity whatsoever. And then you had nationalism and separatism. What's important to understand was that back then the USSR was comprised of 15 different republics that had diverse ethnicities, languages. They saw rising nationalist movements in these various republics, and they were pushing for independence. So you started to see the central government's authority weakening under those types of things where they couldn't contain those movements anymore. And then you had the Cold War pressure, which was the competition with the West, particularly the U.S. Russia or USSR's resources were drained. You had the arms race, the space race, and the proxy wars, i.e., Afghanistan, that overextended the USSR. And the America's economic strength and ideological appeal contrasted with the Soviet declines. So
Yeah.
you also had leadership and power struggles too. Gorbachev's reforms alienated the hardline communists who attempted a coup in August of 1991. The coup failed, and it weakened the central government. So you had that, and then you had the social discontent. You had the decades of repression and censorship and low living standards that eroded public faith in the regime of the Communist Party. Glasnost exposed the historical atrocities, i.e., Stalin's purges, which they tried to hide and they couldn't. So it's not really a myth that the USSR collapsed. That actually happened, but it was a false victory that America claimed because they failed to crush the ideology, the ideology of communism.
Yeah.
And that continued to move on because you still had a lot of the folks that were the oligarchs that remained in Russia that were still getting rich after the Soviets collapsed. They were taking their arms and they were selling them on the black market. The people weren't getting food. They were not able to take advantage of any of the resources that were freed up when the USSR fell. So that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Yeah. That's a great breakdown of this. And really the thing that I think that we could draw a parallel to, for those of us that remember when we declared victory in Iraq, just excuse me, in like 2004, 2005, something like that. And there was a vacuum that happened when we pulled our troops back, and that was filled by ISIS. Same religion, similar ideology, and it was ISIS moving back into those old areas that the vacuum was created. So we have a similar situation here where the power structure failed, but the deep-rooted ideology was still there. So it was just filled by more of itself in a lot of ways, and that's really why we have to understand that you can't. Containment is not an option. As we closed out the last episode on Sunday, we stressed that containment's not an option with this ideology, and this is why. Because if you just try and contain it, when it fails, it's just going to collapse back in on itself and grow the same thing again. Repackaged, rebranded, but it's the same exact thing.
Well,
And
so we tried to contain that when we had McCarthy, and I mean that's just one example. We had McCarthy. McCarthy was right, and
yep,
he was told to stand down.
yep. Yeah, the Red Scare, as I get older and older and I start to look back at history, the Red Scare was a very, very real thing. It was a real threat. And McCarthy was, everybody always uses the term McCarthyism. This is McCarthyism. No, he was actually just calling out what was actually there. There were communists, and there were a lot of people that were communist friendly. Heck, in the early 1900s, FDR expressed interest in both Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini's method of governing their countries. That was our own president.
And look how that turned out.
Right. And so it's not a new thing. This ideology attracts the worst kind of people. I strongly consider FDR one of our worst presidents in the history of this country, along with several others. But yeah, I mean, it was this is not a new thing, and I think we've proven that. But This article is very interesting from the Heritage Foundation, and the article discusses how corruption and lack of economic freedom in the post-Soviet states allowed Marxist networks to persist, and highlights how the KGB alumni and the oligarchs maintained influence. Putin is a KGB alumni, by the way, using economic chaos to regroup and under new guises while the West assumed communism was defeated. And then they took power, and now, in one of the interesting things in this article, this was in 2021, Heritage Foundation does an index of economic freedom, and Russia's economic freedom score was 61 out of 100, making its economy the 92nd freest out of 178 countries whose economies were scored. So they're right in the middle of the pack. They're not really free necessarily, and they are just they're kind of a shell as far as power goes from what they were in the 1980s. But make no mistake, the roots of communism still live in that country to this day. Anything else that we want to add to this?
Oh, we could talk for episode upon episode upon episode. I mean, there's been so many narratives that have been given about the collapse. I guess the point of it is that the collapse of the USSR was real, but the collapse of communism never happened. That's the point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that brings us to really the next, and probably, we could spend an entire episode or entire series of episodes on Russia today, and really where all of this goes. But I think one of the bigger ones, I know the biggest one, and that is China. And China has China learned, I think, a lot from the collapse of the USSR, and they adapted. This was Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s that supposedly had put away the old Maoist regime to enter the world stage. But China had learned a lot on how to hybridize their beast. And that's what they did over the next few decades, is they were building a hybrid beast that could fuel itself with free market principles, I guess you could say. At least take advantage of the free markets, and where the free markets are weak, to impose their will on the world stage. And through that period of time and advancing technology and various other things, they turn themselves into the world's most advanced surveillance state. China now is, they keep track of their people via AI with cameras, camera systems, all of this kind of stuff, and they can track where you're going. They restrict your movements. The belt and road leverage that we talked about back in our trade historic analysis of China, the TikTok style data capture. Make no mistake, if your children are on TikTok, get them off of it. It is simply a data mining app for the Chinese Communist Party. And so this article is talking about that Trojan horse, that they are entering through the guise of technology and advanced things that everybody uses. I use DJI products. That's a Chinese made product. They have some of the most amazing technology for drones and cameras, for film, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. But behind all of that is a Trojan horse to gather all of the information they possibly can. And I guarantee you, anybody that has interacted with any of these kind of apps, China has a profile on you because they want to know, and they can predict what you what you are going to do, what your next steps are going to be, and how you're going to govern your life. S2?
Yeah. So this all started in 1978. They had Deng Xiaoping had a policy called reform and opening up. And essentially, he started off by decollectivizing agriculture. So we talked about in the last episode where a lot of the younger people were sent out to the countryside into the communes or forced labor camps, and they were forced to produce. Well, they realized that that was unproductive. So what he did was he decollectivized agriculture, basically allowing farmers to sell surplus produce on the to the market. And he established special economic zones like Shenzhen, where foreign investment, private enterprise, and export-driven industries were encouraged with tax breaks and relaxed regulations. So basically, what he did was, you have the carrot and the stick analogy here. They realized that the stick wasn't working, so they waved a phony carrot in front of people, thinking that, okay, well, we're starting to get some of our liberties back, when in reality they really weren't, because what ended up happening was is that the private businesses grew, the state that retained the control over key industries, i.e., energy, banking, telecommunications, and the state-owned entities operated with market principles, but served the CCP strategic goals, ensuring their leverage. So I guess basically what this amounted to was, again, they waved a fake carrot out in front of the people because they figured that if they could relax some of the authoritarian rules that they had, that the people would become more productive, and they did. And they absolutely did. But then behind the curtain, if you pull the curtain back, it's the same old shit, just another day.
Yep. Yep. And that's a combination, because we go back to 1978. Ding's pragmatic economics led and fed into Xi's tech-driven authoritarianism. And that's really what we're seeing, using Confucius institutes as cultural outposts for TikTok, Belt and Road, and data collection to weaken Western influence. And, make no mistake, like, people that railed against the tariffs, we should slap more tariffs on China. This is how dangerous China is. They need to be put back in their place. And the worst thing is the intellectual property theft, because they're literally stealing the technology that we design, the technology that we come up with, and they steal it, they reverse engineer it, and then they make it on slave labor for a vastly cheaper price to undercut our industry. And over a period of about 30 years, they have pulled away our manufacturing ability, all of this stuff. This is all a calculated soft war on the United States of America and all Western influence. Really, they hate our ideology, because our ideology stands for freedom and liberty. And communism cannot be compared to freedom and liberty, because if it's compared to something that actually has true principles, it falls apart because it doesn't make any sense. And that's why they fight against this stuff so much. And quite honestly, because it's a demonic construct.
Well, and it's also kind of hypocritic too, from the point of where China, they love capitalism. Beijing loves capitalism, but
Yep.
what's good for us is not good for you. You can't have capitalism. And that's where you end up with the state capitalism, where the government directs markets through subsidies, state banks, and industrial policies, i.e., Made in China 2025, to prioritize their national goals like technological self-reliance. Well, the problem is they're not technological self-reliant. They have to have somebody to steal their shit from.
Yep.
Which is us. They either steal it from us, or they come over here and we let them work in our universities and develop that technology, which belongs to the United States, and then they take it back to China. I mean, we had a case at MIT. There was a professor at MIT that came over here to work. Came over here from China to work at MIT, and did not disclose that he had a foreign bank account in China, and therefore did not disclose that he was a foreign agent of China. Well, when we found out about that, that dude disappeared and was never to be seen again. He was called back to China.
Yeah. So, and don't think that they're not doing that all over the place. No, I mean, they have billions of people that they can send over here, and because they give them they're trying to always weigh and measure what level of appeasement they give to the people to get them to do what they want without there being a revolt. That's why there was a lot of whispers when the tariffs was going on at that high rate of 150%, that there were a lot of rumblings about the workers basically like, no, you're taking away our comfort. Now we're going to revolt against you. And it doesn't take long in those kind of situations. And they're terrified of that because they can't, like most authoritarian governments, if all of your citizens actually stand up all at once, you can't stop that. You can try, and a lot of people will die, but it's really hard to stop that kind of a wave.
Look, I have an example of that. Look at what happened at the Apple plant in China. This happened a few years ago when the people at the Apple plant said, "We're not doing this anymore," and they started jumping the fence. They have a literal fence around the Apple plant there, and people were jumping the fence left and right, trying to get out of that place. So we're not doing this anymore.
Yep. And actually, so I wanted to bring this up. Reality Check Georgia, or GA, actually put this in the comments about Carl Dix. And yes, Carl Dix is a founding member and representative of the Revolutionary Communist Party of the USA. Let me actually share this real quick.
Oh, we have a lot of professors that are members of these socialist groups.
So
I mean, we had one right here in North Carolina at UNC who was actually at one point in time was head of the Redneck Revolt Antifa group.
Yep. And so here's the thing, and we're going to get into this actually more in the next episode, but it is an important thing to point out is that we have this ideology has seeped into academia, probably worse than any other field. Because in a lot of ways, if you're not in a STEM field, academia is a very bloated beast, in my opinion. If you're not going into some kind of STEM field, the need for a university degree is dwindling down to almost nothing. I know many people who would say, yeah, I mean, getting a liberal arts degree is retarded. Because it's not.
What does that even mean?
Right. And this is really the thing, is that they've infiltrated the places and then incentivized people to go to it, because we've continued to tell the future generations, oh, you need to go to college to be successful. And it's a narrative that's been formed, and I truly believe has been formed by these people that want to get them into college so they can indoctrinate them. And they're not going to indoctrinate all. Some kids come out of there and say, no, I'm not going to fall for this ideology because my parents actually told me that they loved me and were involved in my life and taught me the truth. So I'm not going to fall for this garbage. But there's a lot that do. And because of that, we have this wave of young people coming out and involving. And if you look through the history of communism, the original communist revolution was younger people coming out of academia that thought that they knew better than everybody that was living in the real world, and latched onto this ideology and began having revolutions. It happened in China, it happened in Russia, and it happened in Cuba. I mean, all of these places where this has taken hold has usually been a young, misguided sect of the population. And that's a common reality of the ideology. But that was a little bit of a tangent, but suffice it to say that China is making all of their money off of the backs of our IP that they steal and then they make. And they sell it back to us for pennies on the dollar, undercutting our manufacturing and our development of technology. And I mean, now they've gotten to the point where now they can pay off most of our politicians that are corruptible, and they can rule via that. All of these people that came out about, oh, well, tariffs don't work. Then why does every other country tariff us?
And why did it work at the founding of our country?
Right. So this is, and that is also something that is taught, is modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory is basically that there is no such thing as money. There is no such thing as any of this stuff. We're abolishing money. Well, that's a communist ideology, guys. What did Mao do? Abolished money. That's the whole thing. There is no such thing as money. So then when you take over, you can tell this really wealthy doctor that, hey, you have nothing now. Because that's really
or the only thing that you have to give is your labor. That's it.
Yes.
That's
exactly.
what you trade. That's what you trade back and forth.
There was a movie, not a real well-known movie, back in I want to say the late 80s, early 90s. It's called China Cry. It was a true story about a woman that actually made it through those the communist revolution, and her father was a doctor. And in this movie, her father, who was a doctor, was not a friend of communism, and because of that, he was forced to become a janitor. He was a practicing like surgeon, like a very highly educated surgeon. And he was forced to become a janitor because he didn't agree with the communistic ideology. And then she was forced also to not be able to have more children. She had a little girl first, so she couldn't have another child. And the things that this woman goes through in this movie is it's a great picture of how just the everyday people suffered if they did not get in line. And that is also a characteristic of communism, is to force some so you get the rest to fall in line. Make examples. So, and that's been in China since the beginning of the Mao takeover in the 1940s and 50s. So that's kind of where China has moved into this position. And so now let's get into another big hitter that not very many people talk about because it's kind of forgotten, and that is Venezuela and the Chavez takeover in Venezuela. Chavez petro-socialism playbook, and then Maduro, who followed him up after Chavez died. And so what a lot of people don't realize is that Venezuela was one of the richest countries when it came to natural resources. When they first discovered oil in the Venezuelan area, I think this was in the early 1900s. Like there was Venezuelan oil rigs down there when we were really having the oil rush in like Oklahoma and Texas. There were guys going down to Venezuela to drill for oil, and it was extremely rich. And over the decades following, by rights, Venezuela should have been one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And because of the communistic socialistic ideology of Chavez and other leaders predating him, it was a hellhole. It was, it fell to like where people were eating dogs and cats, their own pets, because they were so starved. And, we still pay a crap ton of money to foreign countries for oil. So there is no excuse for this fall. But it led to this article talks about how the chronicles of Venezuela's descent from Chavez socialist policies funded by oil. So this is kind of one of those things. It's kind of a failed model of what China is doing, is that they were funding all of the socialistic stuff through their oil, which is you make a lot of money off of. And because they were using socialistic policies and not free market capitalism, they ended up just bankrupting their country. And then the Maduro regime was where the economic collapse, famine, and mass exodus happened. And this has been fairly recently that this happened. So S2, I'm going to give you a chance to talk through some of the Venezuela stuff that you're aware of, so that we can really cover this well. Did I lose you? You're muted, bud.
This really all started with the Bolivarian revolution, where Chavez aimed to redistribute the wealth and reduce inequality and assert anti-imperialist sovereignty. And they, as you mentioned, they wanted to use oil as its backbone. The key elements to this playbook included using oil as the economic engine. nationalization. Chavez nationalized key industries, notably the oil sector in 2007, taking control of the Petróleos de Venezuela and forcing foreign companies into joint ventures under the state dominance. And this gave the government direct access to the oil revenues, no matter who was drilling it or who was exporting it. And at that time, their estimated worth was nearly 1 trillion between 1999 and 2014. And then you had the petro diplomacy, where Chavez used oil to build influence through initiatives like Petrocaribe. They provided subsidized oil to the Caribbean and Latin American nations, and ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, and then essentially infiltrating those countries and regions where they were able to foster anti-U.S. alliances with countries like Cuba. And then they had social programs where oil money funded social welfare programs such as education, healthcare, and housing. And they wanted to reduce poverty from 49.4% to 27.4% by 2011. And equality, I don't even know what that means, but it was basically the whole thing had widespread support amongst the working class, which or the communists. We'll just say that for what it is. Anytime you hear the word labor or working party, those are your communists. And then you had the political consolidation that was part of the playbook as well, where Chavez in 1999 rewrote their constitution, renaming Venezuelan the Bolivarian Republic, and expanding his presidential powers, including ending term limits. And then he implemented authoritarian measures with loyalists, where the media was restricted and nationalized private businesses that created a competitive authoritarian regime. And you had some economic policies that went along that, where you had price and currency controls. Where have we heard that before recently? Where an example was Kamala Harris talking about wanting to regulate the prices of consumer goods because she felt like corporations were price gouging Americans. So that's a modern day example of where we've heard that. And then you had the welfare expansion, which was the social spending, but it was fiscally unsustainable, relying heavily on high oil prices. So your biggest problem with that was that they could not really pressure the United States. It wasn't until Joe Biden started selling off our strategic oil reserves to China, of all places, that Venezuela could insert themselves into our politics and be able to have some influence within our politics. So that's how they were able to do that. If it wasn't for Joe Biden and his cronies, they would not have been able to do what they tried to do to the United States. So fortunately, I think at this point in time, I think we've kind of staved that off a little bit.
Yeah. So, and reality check GA, putting some awesome stuff in the chat. I remember this. There's a video on Live Leak from Venezuela. I remember this back when the economic collapse was happening in the early 2000s, where they actually burned a man alive for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his family. That wasn't even like people eating their pets, like eating garbage. This was a horrible, horrible collapse, and many people died. And you talk to anybody who had been able to migrate from Venezuela legally into the United States, and they'll tell you that like they're so anti-communist, anti-socialist, like just like anybody that left, that was able to flee Korea or South Korea or North Korea or China during its imposition of this crap. They'll tell you they're the most anti-communist people you will ever meet in your life, and I've met some of them personally. You mentioned the word communism, there is a visceral reaction with these people because they lived it. It's not some fairy tale in a book that just hasn't been tried the correct way. It is a hellscape. It is a disaster. It is the complete and total destruction of all that you have known your entire life in the world, and it's fun. It's fueled by evil ideology. So people that have fled those things, man, you start to talk to them about that, and you literally like, whoa, calm down, dude. But
Well, see, here's the problem that Venezuela has run into, is that we are also the only country in the world that can refine the sludge oil that they're pulling out of the ground right now. So they have a dependence upon us. If we were to stop buying their oil, they would collapse again.
Yep. And so we're trying to keep this more on a global view on this, and kind of tying it back to the United States. So the next really, did you have anything else on Venezuela that we wanted to cover? I think we've covered a good chunk of what's going on.
All of these periods in time, you could talk for days on this stuff.
Yeah,
there's just so much
absolutely.
detail on it that we're not even scratching the tip of a pin's surface for that.
We're essentially giving you guys a summation of each one of these things, because yes, there is so much that goes into it. And the more you start researching this stuff, if you're a normal minded person, just a logical person, you're like, this is clearly evil, demonic garbage that has been able to thrive in this world, and embraced by many people. Yeah, S2's right. We could spend hours just talking about one country. So anyways, but moving on, and we're moving more into a modern framework of what's going on in the world up to about that 2015. And we've seen things like the IMF, World Bank, conditionalities to bake in socialism. This has gotten worse over the last 2 decades. And it started really in the early 2000s with that push towards attaching little policies or little requirements to get these loans. Spoiler alert, countries operate a lot of times like businesses do, and they borrow money from other countries. Unfortunately, we do that too. China buys a lot of our bonds, which is another reason that we need to actually get them, because at some point they're going to call that check. They're going to call that note. And that's going to end one of 2 ways. And one way is going to end in a war, because that's typically what happens in these kind of situations. But I digress. The IMF and the World Bank have started this attachment and wrapping socialist policies within these loans that are given out to other countries to softly wedge socialist policies into these countries. This is the ESG scores, the I'm drawing a blank.
Sustainable development goals.
Sustainable development, and that's the next thing that we're going to talk about. Is the movement from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. A very, very famous thing that the WEF wants to push on all of these countries. And this is the reparations movement is a part of this. BLM in 2020, and we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because we're going to cover that in depth. But all of these things are a part of this to destabilize and incentivize you getting in line behind socialist policies. And this is all just a cloaked wolf in sheep's clothing that slow walks socialism into places where they couldn't just, bring it to shores like in Russia and China. It's the beginning of the long march through the institutions, the corruption. And I think that in particular, when we talk about that 2008 to 2015 period, who was the president of the United States at that time? And a clear socialist communist.
Wasn't that that guy with the big ears?
The guy with the big ears.
Married to a dude.
I mentioned earlier. I mentioned earlier that I have a top 5 worst presidents. Woodrow Wilson is one of them. FDR is one of them. Barack Obama, Joe Biden, really I can just blame Barack Obama for Joe Biden. And the fifth spot is kind of a rotating door, just depending on the day. There, but those four are solidly in my top four, and I think Obama's probably in the modern age. I think FDR may edge him out a little bit just because of all of the damage he did in 4 terms as president, because you didn't have term limits back then. He did a lot of damage to gun rights, putting us into a nanny state, setting us up for a nanny state, and really destroying the country's fabric through the Great Depression, something that should have only taken 6 months to recover from, maybe a year. And it took a decade almost to recover from that because of his poor management or intentional mismanagement. But I digress again. Obama was in the modern age the worst, absolute worst president, because he put a lot of the stuff that had been in the fringes into the White House, into the government, and he pushed ideologies and put wedges back into stuff like race issues. You know, in the 1980s, 1990s, like race wasn't, aside from like maybe the Rodney King thing, but race was not the forefront issue in the 80s and the 90s. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I don't remember this being this big hot button issue, but as soon as Obama became the president, that started to become a wedge issue even more. And he made both sides emboldened. And this was all a part of the communistic ideal, is to separate on the wedge issue that you can. And then once you separate, then you take control of what they will allow you to do. S2?
That was a whole lot to swallow there. I don't know that I can go any further with that.
Well, and I'll bring up this. At Reality Check GA, you are just dropping some truth bombs, man. William Ayers, that was a part. He was a mentor of Barack Obama. He was a part of the Weather Underground movement, which tried to bomb governments, and was a communist. And that was one of the mentors, a very dear friend. Actually, I think he was a neighbor of Barack Obama in Chicago at one point.
I think he was a friend of his uncle's, actually, is the way the story was portrayed, which means that he was probably a CIA plant.
Right. And then you look at Jeremiah Wright, who was supposedly his Protestant pastor, not God bless America, God America. And these are the influences that were in Barack Obama's life. Even in his book, he talked about hanging out with communists in college and all of this kind of stuff. So he was very heavily influenced by that.
That's a common thread there too. If we look in the past, at all of the dictators and authoritarians that have imposed tyranny on their countries, they've all gone to elite schools.
Yes.
And they've all come out of academia in some way, shape, or form.
Which is so telling. And this is not me bashing academia at all. I think that academia is a necessary thing, but I think, as I said earlier, it's bloated. It's one of those things that we have.
I think academia is only necessary to promote actual ability to solve problems, not to be fed and regurgitate things that you're being told by people that have beliefs that are separate from what you believe.
Yeah. And so the real issue that I have with academia is the fact that we're giving out degrees for stuff that doesn't really help anybody. It doesn't help anybody in the country. It doesn't help our economy. It doesn't help the growth of anything. And we're calling that, that is more important than actually, there are people out there that are not cut out for college, and they'll go get a blue collar job and they'll work their butts off and they'll be very successful. I have a nephew that didn't even graduate high school. The dude's making a crap ton of money because he found something that he can do that's really, really important. He actually he works in the coal mines, and he's a genius with that stuff. He can fix just about anything. Guy never went to college, and he's one of the honestly, as far as just being able to figure things out and analyze stuff. He's one of the smartest guys that I know under the age of 30. And that's the reality of it. Like we all have different gifts and different abilities, and to force everybody into this wedge of like, you have to get a college degree, you have to get a college degree. I would say yes for some people. But the problem is all of these professors, they need to get more people into these classrooms so they can pay, so the college can pay these bloated salaries to them, so they can enrich themselves and let a teaching assistant teach half their classes, and they can just go and find themselves in more communism. It's a complete Ponzi scheme in a lot of ways.
Every job that I've had in my profession over the last 30 years, I always ask my prospective employers one thing: do you want somebody with a track record that can do the job, or do you want somebody that has a piece of paper that says you can do the job?
Yep. All that the piece of paper to me says, and I know people with doctorate degrees that would tell you this too, is all that it says is that you can pay attention long enough to pass a test and get that piece of paper. You've been able to do the requirement. It has nothing to do with your work ethic, and it has really little to do with your intelligence level. It just shows that you can regurgitate information that you're given,
or your skills,
skills.
Because in my industry, there's a lot of people that lie in my industry, and when you go around and you can say, no, they lie, this is what the reality of life is.
Yep. So here's the other side of this, and this is probably what we're going to close out with because we have about 10 minutes left. We won't get to everything that I had, and I didn't expect that we would. But here's the other one: is the climate communism. And I think I'm just going to start calling it that, climate communism, because it's exactly what it is. It's based off of a lie. You can look throughout history and you can tell there have been warming periods and cooling periods, and some of the worst storms ever recorded by mankind happened centuries before now. Doesn't mean there still aren't storms here, but the way that they manipulate information, there's a lot of really good information out there on how they manipulate climate change to make it seem worse than it actually is. Because the reality is, over the last 100 years, less people have died from heat and cold, from warming, specifically warming. That has the bottom has dropped out of that. Freezing, yes, that still kills people, but not at the rate that it did 100 years ago. Not even close. I mean, it's like a fraction of that. And they want to continue to tell you that, oh, more and more people are dying because of these weather patterns or because of this climate change. That's certifiably false. It's certifiably false. And always it's the carrot on a stick that we keep talking about. 10 years, Greta Thunberg. In 10 years, my generation is going to pay for this. Blah, 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 blah. How dare you? No. I remember
10 years later, we're still here.
Well, I'm still waiting on the inconvenient truth to come true. Al Gore's famous movie from, I think it was 1999 or 2000, right around when he was running for president. And none of what he predicted came true, because this is all based off of hypothetical models. It's not based off of the real data. And so they can make a lot of it. If you've gone to a statistics class in college, you realize very quickly that you can make data say just about anything you want to. It's just in the manipulation of it. And that's a reality. So you have to take this stuff with a grain of salt. And in all honesty, we have to see what it's cloaked in. It's cloaked in to give us more control, drive your electric car, cut your footprint way down while we fly around the world in our jumbo jets, causing a higher carbon footprint than an entire city with one trip. But, you guys live in the pods, eat the bugs, and do all of this stuff. And we're going to live our life of luxury. We're not going to quit eating meat. You're going to have to quit eating meat, but we're going to do it because we are more important. I think it was John Kerry, when they asked him, why do you fly commercial? And he said, well, I mean, the importance of my job is, I have to use these private jets because my job is so important. Well, what an elitist.
You just come out and say, I'm a communist narcissist.
Exactly. Exactly. It's the same spirit, guys. It's exactly what we've been talking over the last half dozen episodes. We've talked about this. It's here still, and it's infecting our. The problem is that it infects people that actually have power. That's the fear. That's why they hate Donald Trump so much, is because he is a part of that group, the elite group. He walked around in those circles for years, but he doesn't buy into their bull crap.
And that's why they hate him.
And he can't be bought because he doesn't need more money. You know, it's not like Nancy Pelosi that just needs more money and needs more money. He doesn't need more money. In fact,
Ben
he has
Jerry's
lost
is getting
money
expensive.
over the last decade. Lots of it.
Ben and Jerry's is getting expensive, man.
Right.
Box grandma.
Well, let me just answer this. This is off topic. Gary Elliott, what did FDR do to curtail gun rights? The National Firearms Act, which was essentially a tax. Originally, when it was drafted, they wanted handguns as a part of that. A $200 tax in 1934 was the exact same as if they did a $5,000 tax on buying a handgun or buying a suppressor. So yeah, he did a lot, and he was the foremost pusher of that bill. And yeah, so there you go. He absolutely.
The grasshoppers were afraid the ants were going to rise up.
Yeah. So anyways, as we close out here, I think that one of the things that we need to take into consideration is the fact that this is not a dead ideology. It's not I don't even know if it's a dying ideology. I think right now we're in sort of a pushback against this. But make no mistake, these ideologies are willing to slow walk. They are willing to push and push. Glenn Beck had a great analogy of how progressives work, and I would
They nudge.
Exactly. They'll nudge, they'll push, they'll nudge, but what they don't do typically is they don't give back the ground that they have already taken. So they nudge you, and then they wait for you to get lackadaisical. They wait for you to get tired, to get comfortable, and then they nudge you again. And then they nudge you again. And if you're not constantly being vigilant about it, eventually you're going to be like, wait, how did we get here? How in the world? Like, why are they saying that I have to give my kid gender reassignment surgery? How did this come about? Because you had your head in the sand for years, and you
didn't listen to people like us.
Exactly. This is why we're sounding the alarm, guys, because it's that important. It's the same thing that that all of honestly, I become more and more fond of the movie A Few Good Men and Jack Nicholson's character. The speech that he gives at the end of that, when he's actually on the witness stand, is probably one of the more powerful speeches. Is like, you don't really want to know the fact that you need people like me, because the reality is those guys that maybe his method was wrong, but those guys weren't measuring up that ended up dying. They weren't measuring up to the standard. As a former Marine, well, nobody's a former Marine. S2 understands that. You have to be able to rely on the person next to you in the fight. And he realized that because they were in a dangerous situation. Now, did the guys need to die? No. But the reality is he saw the problem. And a lot of us don't want to think about that kind of stuff. We don't want to think about this game gets dangerous. This game gets nasty, and it can get violent. That's not me calling.
We're seeing that now as the left is starting to escalate based on some of the things that have happened just over this past weekend. The violence is escalating. The shooting of the 2 Israeli staffers, that was, and it has nothing to do with Palestine. None of it.
Nope.
It all has to do with destroying capitalism. You have to understand their language. I'll say it again. Everybody needs to go out on X. They need to find Karlin Boroshenko out there. They need to start studying her work. She has a Substack on it. She's got breaks it down for you, what their language means, what they actually mean when they say something. It doesn't have a damn thing to do with Israel. It doesn't have a damn thing to do with Palestine. It has to do with the destruction of capitalism. Period.
It's a wedge issue. That's what they're always looking for, is a wedge issue to get in and separate, people that have different ideas that would most of the time agree on other things, and then they take control of more and more and more. It's the same pattern since 1919. It's the same pattern. And as we continue on in this, because we're going to get into the slow walk through the institutions in the next episode. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. I think we've covered a lot of ground, but we're also giving you guys a contrast of what's going on and how we need to remain in this fight, because our future generations, I want to have this fight now so that my kids can inherit a country that's free, and I don't have to worry about my kids being put into a prison camp, because the way I'm raising my kids, they're going to stand against this stuff. And so I'd rather the fight happen now. And I would rather the fight happen to where it doesn't have to be an all-out bloodbath, because that's the reality of what we're dealing with. These people, if you don't agree with them, the end game is to silence you and to erase you, to unalive you, if you do not bow to their power. S2, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to close it out.
Well, I'll just say one thing about climate change. It happens 4 times a year.
Yes. Yep. The last F4 tornado that went through Southern Illinois was the year I was born, and we just had another one. It's been the biggest one they've recorded this year. Lots of damage. Nobody lost their life. And the one when I was a child, 10 people lost their life. It did a lot of damage. But you know what? That was 40 years ago. What's the difference between then and now? I mean, what? So to say that everything's getting worse, I just don't buy it. But anyways,
that's not to say that any of it isn't man-made either.
Yeah. And we won't dig too deep into that rabbit hole, because that'll get our whole channel freaking canceled. But yeah, who knows? And spoiler alert, if you have patents for certain things, and I'm not going to say what they are, that usually means they exist. I'm just saying. So anyways, I want to leave you guys with this. We serve a sovereign God. As Christians, conservatives, and Americans, we know who is in control, and we just have to do our due diligence and let him do the rest. So stay with your families, pray with your families, teach your children the truth about the evils of these demonic ideologies, and educate your communities. Anybody that will listen, have these conversations with them, because this is the most important fight of our lifetimes. And it's not going to change. They want to take over anything that is a symbol of freedom. So if you want to keep the fight alive, just drop some thoughts in our Substack or Patreon or our Signal chat if you already are a Guardian. If you're not a Guardian, some of the benefits is you get more of this kind of content. You get more information, and that's important in the age of information and misinformation, disinformation, to get it from people that really take seriously the intel that we use. And if we get something wrong, we admit it. That's rare in today's media and clickbait news ecosystem. Benefits include the daily sit rep for 6 days a week. Saturday's the only day that we don't do a live stream like this. Access to the private Signal chat, $370 worth of survival dispatch insider emags, access to the backup Signal Substack chat that we have just started, we've just launched, and early access to JJ Morris's videos twice weekly, and Sunday threat matrix on the emerging threats, the SDEN Survival Dispatch Emergency Notification System, to give you guys all of the tools and information that you need to survive, to keep your family safe, and to keep America free. So I'm very, very happy that you guys joined us today, and continue to join us on this. It's important. And thank you for every listener, especially our subscribers, because you guys are the real rock stars here. You keep us fueled for our mission, and you spend countless, couldn't spend the countless hours of digging the truth for you and getting through all this information without that. You guys rock. And we want to be the trusted voice of conservatives and conservative news and ideology. And we want to give you guys that for your families, for your faith, and for your freedom. I'm John Wheaton signing off. And before we sign off, I'm going to quickly say a prayer, and then we'll call it a night. Heavenly Father, as always, I thank you for this opportunity to speak truth, to impart knowledge to those out there who want to know more about how to spot the enemy, how to spot evil. And I pray that you help us. You give us eyes that can see all of this stuff. You give us ears to hear the truth, and you give us hearts that are pounding for freedom, and that we fight the good fight while we're here on this earth. Lord, I know that you have a plan for each and every one of us, and I pray that you bring that plan to our mind and you show us what it is. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thank you again. We'll see you guys soon. Chris will be back tomorrow with another episode, just spreading truth as usual. Until then, Jesus is King, and God bless America.
Hoorah.
Trump is something special. Nobody is even close to Donald Trump. It's not close. Trump is so special that people don't realize. And I'm telling you, no one's like him. DJT is so unique, it really is, it's hard to describe. No one's like him. Nobody is even close. Nobody. When you talk about sacrifice, danger, management, leadership, structure, vision, it's not close. The boss is that far out in front and that much better than everybody else.
Time.